Greetings, everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know where and what time you're listening from. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy our stories, leave a like and subscribe so you never miss one. Now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and relax. The loneliness of my life was measured in square feet of glass. My apartment was small, but my office was a glass box on the 34th floor of the West Tower. I spent more time there than at home. The job was demanding, sure, but the real reason for my late hours was the stillness. I liked the feeling of being suspended above the sleeping city, a single point of light in a sea of darkness, watching the world move below without having to be part of it. My only companion was the building across the street, the East Tower. It was our twin, an identical facade of dark glass and steel rising on the other side of the road. So close I sometimes felt I could reach out and touch it. It was a dead mirror, a dark monolith reflecting the lights of my own tower. For months the East Tower had been empty. The employees of the previous company had left overnight and the building stayed silent, a grim reminder of corporate failure. I'd gotten used to its blackness. It became the backdrop to my nights. I was the only light on the 34th floor of the West Tower, and my light reflected faintly in the dark facade of the East Tower. The first incident was subtle, so easy to dismiss that I forgot it almost instantly. I was working late, head buried in a spreadsheet. It was past 11 at night. I looked up to rest my eyes, staring into the darkness of the building across the street. And I saw a light, not a distant window or a maintenance light. It was a light identical to my own office, a single illuminated rectangle on the 34th floor of the East Tower. I stared, confused. It seemed I had a new neighbor. Inside that rectangle of light, I could make out the silhouette of a desk, a chair, a bookshelf. It was an exact replica of my own office. And sitting in the chair was a man. A dark silhouette against the light. I felt a strange sense of camaraderie. Another lone worker stuck late like me. I raised my hand, a shy wave across the void. The figure on the other side didn't move. He stayed hunched over his desk. I looked away, feeling a bit foolish, and went back to work. An hour passed. Work consumed me. When I looked up again, exhaustion weighed on my eyelids. The light across the street was still on. The man was still there. But something was different. I was leaning back in my chair, but the silhouette across the street was still bent over the desk. I looked closer. I stretched, raising my arms above my head. The figure didn't move. A chill ran down my spine. It was a prank. It had to be. Maybe a mannequin, some weird decoration. I grabbed the small binoculars I kept in a drawer to watch the street traffic far below. I focused on the window across the street. The glass distorted the image slightly, but what I saw froze my blood. The furniture was identical to mine. The same desk lamp, the same plastic plant in the corner, and the man sitting in the chair. It was me, not someone who looked like me. It was me. He wore my same blue shirt, had my same haircut. The only difference was that he was working furiously, typing with intensity, while I watched, paralyzed, binoculars in hand. I dropped the binoculars. My heart pounded. It was an optical illusion, a reflection. But how could it be a reflection? The East Tower was across the street, 50 yards away. It was physically impossible for my office to reflect with such clarity, let alone for the reflection to move independently. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my palms against them. Exhaustion was playing tricks on me. I was hallucinating. I looked again. The light was still there, and the other me was still typing. I stood, hands trembling, and turned off my office light. The room went dark. I looked out the window. Across the street, the light in Office 34 East went out too. The darkness stared back at me. I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. It had been a reflection. A weird phenomenon, but a reflection nonetheless. My light had created the illusion. I turned my light back on. The office across the street stayed dark. I felt like an idiot. I was so tired my brain had conjured a ghost. I gathered my things and went home. I didn't work late for the rest of the week. The image of my double lingered in my mind, but I'd filed it away as a warning of my own burnout. I needed rest. But curiosity got the better of me. The following Monday, I stayed late again. Night fell. The other offices in my tower went dark. By 10, I was alone again. Heart pounding, I looked out the window. The east tower was dark. I breathed a sigh of relief. It was just exhaustion. But at 11 on the dot, as if an invisible switch had flipped, the light in office 34 East came on, and he was there, sitting in the chair, motionless. This time I wasn't typing. I was standing by the window watching him, and he was watching me. He didn't move. He just sat there, a perfect copy of myself in an identical setting, staring at me across the void. A cold panic gripped me. I turned off my light. His stayed on. I turned mine back on. He was still there, staring. I backed away from the window. I tried to work, but I couldn't focus. I could feel his gaze on my back. It was a presence, a constant surveillance. It lasted for hours. Me, pretending to work. Him, motionless, watching. Around 2 in the morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what this was. I grabbed my phone and looked up the number for the East Tower's administration. I found a contact for office leasing. I called, expecting voicemail. To my surprise, a night security guard answered. I asked as casually as I could manage if office 3401 was occupied. There was a pause. 3401, the guard repeated. No, sir. The whole building's empty. We're doing a full electrical remodel. There's no power on any floor above the lobby. No way a light could be on up there. My phone slipped from my hand. Cold sweat ran down my back. The building had no power. I slowly raised my eyes to the window. The office across the street was still there, brightly lit. My double was still sitting, staring at me. And then, very slowly, he raised a hand and waved. With terrifying calm, he picked up the phone on his desk, a phone that wasn't ringing in my office, and started talking, nodding as if having a serious conversation. I grabbed my jacket and bolted from the building. I didn't look back. The next day, I tried to convince myself the guard was wrong. There had to be a rational explanation. At lunch, I went to the East Tower. The lobby was covered in dust and scaffolding. The same security guard I'd spoken to was at the desk. I asked if I could see the 34th floor. He looked at me oddly but took my West Tower ID, buying my story about a potential company expansion. He shrugged and led me to the service elevator. The 34th floor was a construction mess. The floors were torn up, the ceilings exposed, revealing a tangle of wires and pipes. No walls, no offices, just an open, dark space. We reached the corner that matched my office. It was empty. No desk, no chair, no plant. Just a huge, dusty window. I approached the glass and looked across. I could see my own office in the West Tower, small and distant. My desk, my chair. Everything looked normal. And then I saw the symbol. It was etched on the inside of the empty window's glass right where I stood. It was the same angular labyrinth I'd seen in my mirror. Someone had drawn it in the dust, then scratched it into the glass itself. My fingers brushed the etched symbol. It was rough, real. The incongruity of the scene hit me like vertigo. I was standing in an empty, dark, dusty 34th floor, but the proof of my double's existence was right there, carved into the glass, in the one place he could touch from his side. The guard, oblivious to my discovery, shifted impatiently behind me. His radio crackled with static. "Seen enough, sir? I need to lock up the floor." I nodded, unable to speak. My throat was dry. I wiped my sleeve over the symbol, a futile attempt to erase it, to hide the evidence. The guard didn't seem to notice. The long descent in the service elevator was torture. The guard hummed an off-key tune, a mundane sound that clashed violently with the impossible horror I'd just confirmed. Every second in the East Tower felt like I was drifting further from my own reality, as if I were stepping into enemy territory. When I crossed the street back to my tower, the air felt warmer, more real. But I no longer felt safe. My sanctuary had an indiscreet window, a window through which something was watching me. I spent the rest of the day in a feverish paranoia. I pretended to work, but my eyes kept drifting to the building across the street. In daylight, Office 3401 East was just a normal reflection of the sky and my tower. Innocent, asleep. But I knew what happened when night fell. I decided to research the symbol. It was my only tangible clue. I spent hours online, searching databases of occult symbols, forums on strange architecture. Nothing. The angular labyrinth didn't appear in any known grimoire or ancient culture. It was unique, personal. This deepened my terror. It wasn't an ancient legend, it was a new connection, a door that had somehow opened between my office and that void on the other side. The symbol was the key, or maybe the lock. That night I couldn't go home. I had to see it again. The office emptied out. The sun set. The city lit up. By 10, I was alone. I made coffee, my hands trembling slightly. I sat in my chair, but this time, I turned it to face the window directly. I waited. 11 o'clock. Like clockwork, the light in Office 3401 East came on. My heart lurched. He was there, sitting in his chair, exactly like the first night. But this time he wasn't typing. He was motionless, staring at me. I could feel the intensity of his gaze across the 50 yards of emptiness. I decided to test it. Slowly, I raised my right hand and waved. Across the glass, my double raised his left hand. A perfect mirror wave. I felt a momentary relief. It was a reflection. An impossible reflection, defying physics and optics, but a reflection nonetheless. Maybe the combination of the building's special glass and the darkness created this phenomenon. Then I kept my hand raised, and he, my double, lowered his. I froze. My hand was still in the air, but his now rested on his desk. The symmetry was broken. This wasn't a reflection. It was a mockery. With terrifying slowness, the double stood. I was still seated. He walked to his window until his face was inches from the glass, his breath fogging it briefly on his side. I sat motionless in my chair across the street. He stared at me. And then he smiled. It wasn't my smile. It was a triumphant, malicious grin I'd never seen on my own face. Panic seized me. I leapt up, knocking over my chair. The double didn't react. He just kept smiling, relishing my terror. I ran to the office door but stopped. I couldn't run. If I ran, what would happen? I'd come back the next day and find my computer wiped, or my life altered. I had to face it. I turned back to the window. The double was still there, smiling. I tried something else. I turned my chair to face away from the window. I sat, giving him my back. If I couldn't see him, maybe the connection would break. Maybe it only worked with eye contact. I forced myself to stare at the office wall, trying to breathe normally. The silence in the room was thick. I could feel his presence behind me, through the glass, across the street. 1 minute, 2 minutes, nothing. I started to relax. Maybe it had worked, maybe. Then I felt an icy cold on the back of my neck. I slowly raised my eyes to the wall in front of me. A framed calendar hung there, its glass reflecting the room behind me. In the dark reflection, I saw my own neck, and I saw the figure of my double, standing right behind my chair. Not in his building, in mine. I screamed and spun around, sending the chair crashing. No one was there. The office was empty. I ran to the main window. The glass was clear again, showing the nighttime city. Across the street, Office 3401 East was dark. He was gone. The game was over for the night. I collapsed on the floor, trembling, hyperventilating. The connection wasn't just visual. It was seeping through. My own reflection in the small glass of a calendar had become his portal. Every reflective surface in my office, in my life, was now a potential door. From that day on, my life became a nightmare of polished surfaces. I covered the bathroom mirror with a towel. I taped over the microwave's glass. I avoided puddles on the street. In the office, I worked with the blinds down, plunging myself into artificial darkness, terrified of what I might see in the window. But the entity no longer needed reflections. It had found another way to interact. It started moving things. I was working on a critical report, the most important of the quarter. I set my coffee mug next to the keyboard. I watched as the mug, untouched, slid slowly across the wooden desk. 1 inch, 2, until it reached the edge and fell, spilling scalding liquid onto the computer tower on the floor. There was a spark, a smell of burnt plastic, and the computer died. I looked at the window, though the blinds were down. I knew he was there in the darkness, laughing. I lost my job. The missing report, my absences, my erratic behavior, it was unsustainable. They fired me. Now I spent my time in an office that was no longer mine, packing my things into boxes. The West Tower had terminated our lease. We had to move out. It was my last night there. I was alone, packing the last of my books. It was 11:30. I raised the blind one last time. The light in office 3401 East was on, and he was there. But he wasn't alone. He stood by his desk, and beside him was a female figure. I couldn't see her clearly, but she seemed to be crying. He was comforting her, an arm around her shoulders. Then the woman looked up and the light caught her face. It was filled with anguish. It was my ex-wife, the woman who'd left me a year ago. The double looked at me. He smiled. And then, he did something that shattered the last of my sanity. He leaned down and kissed her. A roar of pure rage erupted from my throat. I ran to the office door, flung it open, and stormed to the elevators. I was going to cross the street. I was going to climb that building. I was going to kill him. I pounded the elevator button. The doors opened. I stepped inside. As I turned, I saw the elevator's interior. The walls were polished steel, a perfect mirror. In the reflection, I saw my own face, pale and furious, but I wasn't alone. Behind me, filling the elevator, were dozens of other versions of me, all staring silently with empty eyes. And right beside me, my double smiled. The elevator doors closed. The elevator hummed and began to descend. I felt vertigo, not from the motion, but from the gaze of all those identical eyes. I stared at the floor, trying not to look, but the brushed metal reflected distorted figures. They were everywhere. The main double, the one beside me in the reflection, raised his hand, my hand, and placed it on my reflected shoulder. I felt nothing, but a bone-deep cold spread through my real shoulder, a mark of possession. The descent was an eternity. Floor after floor, the cabin filled with expectant silence. The other figures in the reflections began to move. They didn't attack. They did something worse. They stopped being me. Their faces changed. I saw my father's disappointed face multiplied. I saw my old boss's angry face. And in every other panel, I saw my ex-wife's face, her expression filled with the same cold pity she'd given me the day she left. The elevator became a theater of my failures. The silent figures reenacted my humiliations. I saw my boss pointing to the door. I saw my father shaking his head in regret. I saw my ex-wife turning and walking away over and over in every panel. They whispered, though there was no sound. Their lips formed the words that had hurt me most. Failure, disappointment, loneliness. I felt the elevator accelerate, a dizzying fall. The mirror walls seemed to close in, pressing against me. The dozens of reflections of my ex-wife leaned toward me, their faces merging into a collective mask of pity. The main double, still my exact copy, didn't move. He just smiled, watching me, enjoying the show, watching me crumble under the weight of my own past. Then he raised his hand. In it, he held something. A key. My office key. He twirled it slowly between his fingers. Then with infuriating calm, he slipped it into the pocket of his pants. My pants. A dull thud snapped me back to reality. The elevator had stopped. Ground floor. The doors opened with a hiss. revealing the lit, empty lobby. I stumbled out, falling to my knees on the marble floor. I crawled, clawing at the ground, desperate to escape the metal box. I stood and ran. I ran through the lobby, ignoring the night security guard who stared at me in shock from his desk. I pushed through the glass doors and out into the cold night air. I stopped on the sidewalk, gasping, my heart ready to burst. I was alive. I was out. The cold air filled my lungs. I looked at my hands. They were mine. The terror began to fade, replaced by shaky confusion. What had that been? A hallucination? A nervous breakdown from stress and loneliness? I looked up. The night sky was calm. I glanced at my tower at the 34th floor. The light in my office, the one I'd just fled in blind panic, was still on. It couldn't be. I'd run out. I hadn't turned anything off. But the light was there, a lone yellow rectangle in the dark facade. And then I saw a figure in the window. It was him. It was me. He stood by the glass exactly where I'd been, and he was looking at me, a small, pathetic speck on the sidewalk below. He wasn't in the East Tower. He was in mine. He was in my office. The air froze in my lungs. No, impossible. I ran back to the lobby. The security guard stood up, blocking my path. "Sir, you okay? You just left." "I have to go up," I said, my voice breaking. "There's someone in my office on 34. The guard frowned, looking at me with a mix of pity and professional confusion. "Sir, that's impossible. The 34th floor is empty. The company moved out this afternoon. You signed the exit papers yourself." The blood drained from my face. "What? No, I didn't sign anything. I work there." My hands fumbled in my pockets, searching for my access card, my key. I found nothing. I felt the smooth lining of my pocket. It was empty. The pocket my reflection had just filled in the elevator. The guard sighed, his hand moving toward the phone. "Listen, sir, I saw you leave a minute ago. You were carrying a box. You said goodnight. Why don't you go home?" I froze. A box. I hadn't been carrying a box. But he had. The double had replaced me, and it hadn't even been a fight. It had been a simple bureaucratic transaction. He'd signed me out of my own life. I turned, defeated, my mind unable to grasp the magnitude of what had happened. I walked slowly to the glass doors. I stopped. I looked at my reflection in the main door's glass. My face stared back, but something was wrong. I smiled, testing it. My reflection smiled, but the smile came a fraction of a second late. A nearly imperceptible delay, an echo. I touched the glass. My reflection touched the glass, but I felt its hand reach a millisecond before mine. Cold, absolute horror flooded me. The elevator, the moment he'd passed through me in the reflection, the smile, the key. He hadn't crossed into the real world to attack me. He'd been waiting. The elevator wasn't an attack. It was the exchange. He was upstairs in my office with my job, my life. And I was here, outside. I had become the reflection. I touched my face. It felt real, solid. But the air around me seemed to have lost its texture. The sound of traffic was distant, muffled. I pressed my forehead to the glass. It was cold. But I didn't feel the cold on my skin. I felt it inside. I'd spent my life watching the world from my glass box, never participating. Now the universe had granted my wish. I'd become a permanent observer, trapped in the glass, on the wrong side of the window. I looked up at the 34th floor window again. The figure was watching me. He raised his hand and waved. The same wave I'd given him that first night. Then he turned, walked to my desk, sat in my chair, and started typing. He resumed my life. I stood on the sidewalk, a silent spectator to my own existence. The city streets suddenly felt cold, unreal. I realized my mundane life hadn't been a shield, but an invitation. My emptiness had left room for something else to enter. And now, the sinister double born from my own loneliness was living the life I hadn't dared to live, while I faded into the shadows. The pain was my only constant companion, a chronic, dull, burning ache that had settled into my back 2 years ago, after an accident the doctors called trivial. But its effects were anything but. It stole my sleep, my job, my ability to move without wincing in agony. Modern medicine had failed me. Pills, therapies, injections, nothing worked. I'd become a recluse in my own apartment, a young man aged before his time with nothing to look forward to but a life of escalating suffering. Desperation is an acid that eats away at skepticism, and I was desperate. It was in that state of absolute vulnerability that I found the circle of relief. They didn't advertise. Their name came to me through a dark corner of the internet, a forum of chronic pain sufferers whispering about a miraculous solution. It was a support group, they said, exclusive and highly private. No healers, no gurus, just other sufferers. It took weeks to get an invitation. The process was strange. A series of cryptic emails that felt more like a psychological interrogation than an application. They used my name, Luigi, in every message, but never revealed theirs. They wanted to know the exact nature of my pain, its intensity, how long I'd been suffering. Finally, they accepted me. The first meeting was in a nondescript office building in a rented conference room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet. There were 12 of us, 12 strangers sitting in a circle, our faces etched with the same chronic pain. There was no visible leader, just a moderator, a tired-looking man who explained the rules. No drugs, no group therapy, just an exercise. A collective mental ritual we had to practice together, every night at the same time from the solitude of our homes. They taught us the technique. It was an intense form of visualization. We had to close our eyes and focus on our pain, not to fight it, but to isolate it. We were to imagine it as a physical mass, a dark, heavy stone inside us. Then at exactly 10 o'clock each night, we all had to mentally push that stone out of ourselves. We were to visualize it traveling, joining the other stones of pain from the circle's members, and sending it far away to a place they called the receptacle. They didn't tell us what or who the receptacle was, only that it was a place that could absorb it. That night I practiced the ritual with the fervor of a believer and the skepticism of a cynic. I sat in my dark living room. At 10 sharp, I closed my eyes. I focused on the fire in my back. I imagined it as a jagged sphere of burning coal. And then I pushed. I visualized it leaving my body, flying through the night, joining 11 other streams of darkness. And the pain vanished. It wasn't gradual, it was instant. Like someone flipped a switch. The fire in my back went out. The weight that had crushed me for 2 years lifted. I opened my eyes, gasping. I stood up from my chair. No pain. I bent down, touched my toes. A movement that would have made me scream the night before. Nothing. I was healed. I cried, for the first time in years, tears of pure, disbelieving gratitude. The days that followed were a rebirth. I walked the streets again, felt the sun on my face. Every pain-free movement was a miracle. The world, which had turned gray and small, regained its colors. Every night at 10, I repeated the ritual with religious devotion, grateful, expelling the residual pain, the echo of agony. The circle had kept its promise. But the cure came at a cost not written in the contract. A week after my first session, my dreams began to change. Before I dreamed of my own pain. Now I dreamed of someone else's. The nightmares were vivid, surreal. I dreamed I was in a small, dark, damp room. I couldn't move. And I felt excruciating pain in my back, the same burning, stabbing pain that had tormented me. But it wasn't my back. In the dream, I was someone else. I woke up drenched in cold sweat, but physically pain-free. They were just nightmares, I told myself. The lingering memory of my own suffering, projecting into my dreams. The 10 o'clock ritual also started to change. When I closed my eyes and sent my pain away, I no longer visualized it traveling to an abstract void. I began to see its destination. I saw the room from my nightmares. And I saw the person receiving my burden. It was a woman. I couldn't see her face clearly, she was always in shadow. She was tied to a wooden chair, or maybe just too weak to move. Her body writhed, her hands gripped the chair's arms, her knuckles white. I could hear her muffled moans. She was the one enduring my pain. The vision lasted only a moment, the exact instant my pain hit her. But the image was so clear, so real, it left me trembling. I began to understand the mechanics of the miracle. The circle didn't destroy pain, it moved it. My relief began to taste like ash. My newfound health felt like stolen goods. Every pain-free step I took was being paid for by that unknown woman in my dreams. I tried to stop the ritual. One night at 10, I just didn't do it. I sat on my couch, eyes open, resisting. At 10:01, the pain returned, not slowly. It was a brutal blow, as if 2 years of compressed suffering hit me all at once. I collapsed to the floor screaming, my back burning as if someone had driven a red-hot poker into it. It was 1,000 times worse than before. The withdrawal was unbearable torture. Crawling, dragging myself, I sat in my chair and performed the ritual in a frantic rush, expelling the agony from my body. The relief was instant, and the guilt overwhelming. I was an addict, and my drug was someone else's suffering. I had to know who she was. I had to find her. At the Circle's meetings, now held online in private, encrypted forums, I tried asking about the receptacle. My questions were met with hostile digital silence. The moderator sent me a private message. "Don't ask questions, Luigi. Just be grateful for the relief. Questions weaken the Circle. Questions bring the pain back." It was a veiled threat. I started investigating the Circle on my own. They were ghosts, no records, no addresses. A group of strangers bound by a terrible pact. My only clue was the room from my visions. It was always the same. Small, damp stone walls, a single high, narrow window with bars, and a heavy wooden door. I began searching for such places in the city. Abandoned asylums, old prisons, monasteries. But it was the visions that gave me the next clue. One night during the ritual, the image was clearer. I saw the woman's face for a moment. She was pale, gaunt, but young. Her name came to me, not as a sound, but as a thought imprinted in my mind during the transfer. Helena. And I saw something else. On the stone wall beside her, there was an etched symbol, a circle divided by 3 angled lines. With that symbol and her name, my search became desperate. I drew the symbol and compared it to databases of iconography. I found it. It wasn't an ancient mystical symbol. It was the mark of a 19th century architect, known for designing prisons and asylums with a philosophy of total isolation. I cross-referenced this with city records. I found a building, the old Piety Sanatorium, abandoned for 50 years, perched on a hill outside the city. A place rumored to be haunted, a place no one went near. I knew it was there, I knew she was there. One night, instead of preparing for the ritual, I grabbed a flashlight, a crowbar, and drove to the sanatorium. The building was a monstrous silhouette against the moon. I climbed the rusted fence and entered through a broken window. The interior reeked of mold and despair. I didn't have to search long. In the isolation wing, I found the hallway from my visions, and at the end, the heavy wooden door. It was locked with a modern, heavy padlock. I heard a sound from the other side, a faint moan. It was her. She was there. As I prepared to break the padlock, my entire body froze. It was 1 minute to 10. The ritual was about to begin. I felt my own pain, absent all day, starting to build in my back, preparing for the leap. And then I realized the trap. If I freed her, the circle would lose its receptacle, and the accumulated pain of 12 people, an ocean of agony, would return to its owners. It would return to me, and the other members, addicted to their relief, would hunt me for taking it away. But if I didn't free her, I was doomed to be her executioner every night. I glanced at my watch. 10 o'clock. The pain hit me. It wasn't my usual pain, that dull, burning ember. It was a flood, an ocean of agony pouring in from 12 directions. It was the collective suffering of the entire circle, a torrent of despair seeking its receptacle. But the connection was broken. The ritual had failed. The pain, with no clear destination, rebounded to its owners. And I, standing by the door, became the lightning rod. I fell to my knees, a choked scream escaping me. The crowbar clattered from my hands. The world turned white and red. And then, through my own agony, I heard hers. A muffled cry, a wrenching sob coming from the other side of the door. Helena. Though the main flow had rebounded to us, the sanatorium's nexus was still active, and the shockwave of pain was hitting her too. Rage, an emotion I'd nearly forgotten, gave me strength I didn't know I had. I crawled, grabbed the crowbar. Ignoring the fire consuming my back and limbs, I stood. I wasn't just breaking a padlock, I was breaking the pact. I jammed the crowbar's tip into the thick metal of the padlock and pulled with all my body's weight. The metal groaned. The sound of my effort mixed with my own moans, and Helena's on the other side. I pulled again, over and over, adrenaline and pain battling for control of my body. With a deafening snap that echoed in the silent hallway, the padlock broke and fell to the floor. The heavy wooden door creaked inward. The darkness inside was near total, the air fetid with fear, sweat, and the smell of ozone. I aimed my flashlight. She was there, exactly as in my visions. Sitting in a wooden chair in the center of the empty room, her wrists and ankles bound to the legs with leather straps. She wore a simple, dirty gown, her body a map of emaciation. Her dark hair clung to her pale, sweat-soaked face. She was trembling violently, the ritual's effects still coursing through her. "Helena," I said, though the name barely escaped my lips. She looked up. Her eyes met the beam of my flashlight. And then she screamed. It was a scream I'd never heard before, a sound of pure, absolute terror. Not the scream of a victim being rescued. It was the scream of a prisoner seeing her executioner enter. She shrank into herself, trying to make herself small, her eyes locked on my face with a recognition that chilled me. She strained to sink into the stone wall, away from me. She thrashed in the chair, pulling at the straps, her body convulsing with panic. She was trying to get away from me. From me. I froze. I didn't understand. I was here to save her. I approached slowly, hands raised, trying to show I wasn't a threat. Every step I took made her scream louder, and then it hit me, with a clarity that froze my soul. Every night at 10, when I and the other 11 circle members pushed our pain onto her, what did she see? She saw our faces. She saw her 12 torturers, 12 psychic ghosts appearing in her cell to unload their agony onto her. To her, I wasn't a stranger, I was one of her monsters. The realization made me step back. I understood the true malignant nature of the circle. We weren't just addicts. We were conscious executioners, even if we'd lied to ourselves. I had to get her out. Ignoring her screams, I approached and started working on the straps around her wrists. The skin beneath the leather was raw. As I did, my gaze swept the room. This wasn't just a cell. On the floor around the chair was a complex circle drawn in what looked like rusted iron dust, dotted with strange symbols. From the wall, thick cables extended, not connected to any power source but ending in copper plates resting against the chair's base. The room wasn't just a cell. It was an engine. The cables were clean, maintained, not covered in dust. The circle on the floor glowed faintly with its own light, a cold energy. The chair wasn't just placed, it was at the exact nexus of the cables and circle. It was a psychic amplifier, a condenser of suffering designed not just to receive pain but to keep the victim alive and receptive for the next cycle. It was an infernal machine. The pain in my back wasn't just an echo, it was a call. I felt the pains of the other 11, their arthritis, their migraines, their shattered nerves, all converging on me, seeking the outlet I'd blocked. I freed one of her hands. She immediately used it to strike me across the face with surprising force. "I don't blame you," I whispered, stepping back. At that moment, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The sound was a profanation in that place of ancient horror. I pulled it out with trembling hands. A new message in the circle's encrypted forum. My heart stopped. I'd completely forgotten about the circle. The message was from the moderator. Short and icy. Ritual failed. The receptacle is compromised. The pain has returned. All members, report. Before I could process it, another message came. And another. A flood of panic and rage from the other members. I can't take it. It's back. It's back. What have you done? The pain is worse than before. The agony of 12 people deprived of their drug. A new message flashed from a woman. It's like acid. It's in my lungs. I'm giving it back. I'm giving it back. The word back repeated over and over. Another wrote, I'll find him. I swear I'll find him. The pain won't return. The moderator cut the communication. The forum went silent. And then the final message from the moderator. Luigi, we sensed your location at the moment of failure. You were at the nexus. You broke the pact. You released the pain. A chill ran through me. I'd thought they were just desperate victims like me. But the moderator knew where the sanatorium was. He knew about the pact. They weren't a support group. They were a cult. And I'd just stolen their miracle. I untied Helena's last strap. She collapsed to the floor, too weak to stand, and crawled to the farthest corner away from me. We don't have time, I said. You have to trust me. I heard a noise outside the sanatorium. The sound of an engine, multiple engines, approaching fast on the gravel path. It wasn't my imagination. It was them. The circle's members. Not just cars. The sound was heavy. Vans. There were 12 of them. Minus me, 11. 11 people consumed by withdrawal and rage driving through the night toward their target. I realized they weren't a support group. They were a pack. They weren't coming to reason. They were coming to reclaim what they'd lost. They were coming to silence me and retrieve their receptacle. Or maybe to find a new one. My gaze fell on myself, on my throbbing back. I realized I was a viable receptacle too. I looked at Helena, curled in the corner, trembling. I looked at the broken door in the hallway. We were in the heart of an abandoned building, trapped between the horror of the past and the very real fury climbing the hill. The pain in my back pulsed, a dull reminder of what was at stake. I had to get Helena out and I had to escape. But the circle, addicted to their cure, wasn't going to let their source of relief, or the man who'd destroyed it, walk away. The nightmare had become real, tangible, and it was about to break down the door. I heard the crunch of gravel outside, the sound of multiple car engines pulling up and stopping abruptly. The slam of doors, a dozen sharp thuds in the night, followed by a chorus of moans. Not cries of rage, but howls of withdrawal agony. They were here, the pack had arrived. I grabbed Helena's arm. She screamed, a high animal sound, and shrank back, striking me with her free hand. Her eyes saw me as one of the 12 monsters from her visions. You have to come with me, I said, though my voice was hoarse and the words felt useless. She didn't understand the danger outside, only the threat in front of her. I dragged her forcibly from the room into the dark hallway. My own back was a hell of liquid fire, the returned pain multiplying with my panic. Every step was agony. Helena fought, clawing at door frames, her nails scraping rotted wood. We heard the sanatorium's main door slam open downstairs. The chorus of cries rose through the stairwell, echoes of pain bouncing off cold stone. Their footsteps were heavy, frantic, spreading through the lobby. They knew this place. I pulled Helena down a side hallway, away from the isolation wing. The sanatorium was a maze of shadows and echoes. Every open door was a dark mouth, every broken window an empty stare. Helena stumbled, her legs weak from atrophy. My back pain doubled me over. We were two broken beings fleeing a pack of desperate monsters. We reached the old kitchen. Stainless steel tables were overturned, the floor littered with broken tiles. The only exit to the outside, a loading door, was blocked by a partial ceiling collapse. We were trapped. I heard their voices in the main hallway. They were closing in, calling my name. Luigi. They knew who I was. The entity hadn't just returned their pain. It had given them a target. I hid Helena in a dark pantry and leaned against the wall, crowbar in hand, waiting. The pain was so intense it blurred my vision. I knew I couldn't fight 11 people. The first to appear in the kitchen's doorway was the moderator. His face, once tired but calm, was now contorted with pain. His bloodshot eyes locked onto me. Behind him, 2 others appeared, a man and a woman. They moved like wounded animals, a desperate need in their eyes. They said nothing. No threats. They just advanced. They didn't want to kill me. They wanted the cure. They wanted Helena. And they wanted me. I was the traitor who'd broken the balance. The first man lunged at me. I swung the crowbar, hitting his knee. I heard bone crack and he fell with a scream. But the woman was already on me, her fingers like claws raking my face. We fought on the filthy floor, a clumsy, desperate struggle. They were weak from their ailments, but their fury gave them unnatural strength. The moderator approached, his face a mask of suffering. I realized I couldn't win. There were too many. My only chance wasn't to escape them, but to destroy the reason they were here. The machine. The Nexus. If I destroyed the chair, the circle would dissolve forever. I shoved the woman with all my strength, sending her crashing into a steel table. I stood and ran. I ran back through the hallways, ignoring their enraged cries, ignoring the fire in my back. I ran toward Helena's cell. I reached the isolation hallway. 2 more members were there, standing before the open door, staring at the empty chair in despair. When they saw me, their expressions turned murderous. They lunged, but I didn't stop. I rammed them with the crowbar and entered the room. The circle on the floor still glowed faintly. The cables were still connected. It was the heart of their faith. The 2 men entered behind me, blocking the exit. The moderator and the others were coming down the hallway, their agonized footsteps echoing on the stone. I was surrounded, no way out. I raised the crowbar over my head. "No!" one of them screamed, his voice breaking with panic. "It's the only thing that saves us." They lunged at once. I brought the crowbar down on the wooden chair, splitting it in 2. But before I could strike the floor's circle, they grabbed me. I fell, feeling their desperate hands on me, hitting, clawing. They were like drowning people trying to breathe. Their only goal to protect the machine. The moderator grabbed the crowbar, trying to wrest it from me. We struggled for it, my back pain blinding me, their moans of agony fueling them. The room hummed. The energy I'd unleashed was still rebounding, seeking a receptacle. I felt a psychic pull. I saw the woman who'd attacked me in the kitchen convulse, her eyes rolling back. The rebounded pain was killing her. With a final scream, I shoved the moderator and struck the floor with the crowbar. I hit the copper plates. The metal bent. I hit the iron circle. Sparks flew. The symbol's light flickered. I struck again and again with blind fury, smashing the arcane machinery. The circle members stopped, their faces frozen in horror. And then a sound. A low hum like the one I'd felt began to grow. The circle on the floor blazed with blinding white light. The cables glowed red hot. The machine, in its destruction, was releasing all the energy it had contained. Not just the pain of recent months, but perhaps decades of stored suffering. The hum became a piercing shriek. The walls vibrated. The circle members clutched their heads, their eyes bulging. The psychic shockwave was invisible but devastating. I saw them collapse one by one, their bodies convulsing violently, foam spilling from their mouths. The concentrated pain, released all at once without a receptacle to contain it, was frying them from within. The moderator looked at me. His eyes filled with terrible understanding before his body went still. The shriek stopped. The light faded. Silence returned to the sanatorium, this time final. I stood gasping amid the motionless bodies of the circle. The pain in my back had returned to its usual level. Dull, familiar, but only mine. I ran back to the kitchen. I grabbed Helena, still hiding in the pantry, trembling. This time she didn't fight. She was too weak, or maybe, seeing me return, she understood I wasn't like them. I carried her in my arms. The sanatorium creaked around me, as if the released energy had damaged its structure. I got us out, not through the main door. I broke a lobby window, and we escaped into the night. We ran, or rather stumbled down the gravel path. while the circle's vans sat with their lights on, doors open, silent witnesses to their owner's fall. It's been months. Helena is in a clinic recovering slowly. She doesn't speak. The doctors say her trauma is too deep. My back pain is back. It's constant, a daily reminder of my old weakness. But now it's different. It's just mine. No longer a miraculous cure demanding a terrible price. It's just pain, clean and honest. Sometimes at night, when the agony is strongest and I'm tempted to seek easy relief, I think of the circle. I think of how easily I accepted a miracle without questioning its cost. The real horror isn't the suffering. It's how easily a man can build a hell for another just to escape his own. My obsession was always light. Not the poetic glow of dawn or the warmth of a candle, but technical, controlled light. As a lighting designer, my life was a battle against gloom, a relentless pursuit of perfect luminance, the exact angle to erase any unwanted shadow. My world was one of lumens, color temperatures, and beam angles. It was logical, predictable, and utterly controlled. When I found the loft in the old industrial district, I knew I'd discovered my ultimate canvas. It was a vast space with soaring ceilings, exposed brick walls, and massive windows overlooking a cityscape of rooftops and metal. It was a mess of odd angles and forgotten corners, the perfect challenge for my obsession. The first days were a ritual of purification. I spent an entire week designing the lighting system. This wasn't just decoration, it was a rewriting of the space. I installed tracks of directional spotlights, recessed floor lights, LED strips hidden behind steel beams. My goal was total coverage, a sanctuary where darkness had no permission to exist. I wanted a place where, with the flip of a switch, I could create an artificial noon in the dead of night. The work took weeks. I calibrated every spotlight, measured the light's reflection off the brick, fine-tuned the dimmers. I was crafting my masterpiece, a place where form followed light. And I succeeded. Almost. There was one spot. A corner of the loft, farthest from the windows where the ceiling sloped sharply to meet an old cast-iron chimney. Something was off about that corner. No matter how much light I threw at it, the darkness refused to budge. I installed a high-powered spotlight on the nearest track and aimed it directly. The darkness didn't vanish. It just grew deeper, sharper, as if it weren't an absence of light, but a smear of wet, black paint. At first I chalked it up to physics. The brick's paint, I told myself, must be some weirdly absorbent material. Or maybe the ceiling's angle created a light trap. I brought in a studio-grade floodlight, a 2,000-watt beast that radiated serious heat, and aimed it at the corner. The beam hit the wall. The shadow stayed. It was impossible. It was like trying to light up the inside of an ink bottle. I left the floodlight on for an hour. When I returned, the metal casing was scorching, but the corner was as dark as ever. And I noticed something else. The dust on the floor, which had hung still in the loft's air, was swirling slowly at the edge of that darkness, as if the shadow had its own gravity, its own atmosphere. That night I didn't sleep well. I woke up multiple times feeling the loft's silence was too heavy. I wandered into the living room in the dark. From across the vast room, the cursed corner was a patch of absolute blackness, a hole in reality. For a moment I thought I saw something move inside it. A flicker, like eyes closing slowly. I flipped on the main lights. The corner was empty, inert, just dark. Paranoia is a seed that only needs a tiny crack to sprout. And my obsession with light was the perfect crack. I started noticing other anomalies in the gloom. I was at my desk, reviewing blueprints. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. I glanced at my own shadow, a familiar silhouette stretched over the planks. I raised my hand to scratch my neck. My hand moved. My shadow moved. But the shadow of my hand seemed to hesitate a fraction of a second before following. I froze. I lowered my hand slowly. My shadow mimicked it, but again with a nearly imperceptible delay, sluggish, like it was tethered to me by a rubber band. I raised my hand again, faster. The shadow matched my speed. I let out a short, nervous laugh. I was seeing things. It was exhaustion, the sunset light playing tricks on my eyes. But the game had already begun, and I wasn't the only player. The shadows started to lie. One afternoon, I left a coffee mug on my table. When I returned from the kitchen, the mug was exactly where I'd left it, but its shadow was wrong. It stretched at the wrong angle, defying the sun's position. And it wasn't the shadow of a mug. It was too long, too thin, almost like the shadow of a knife. I stared, a cold sweat prickling my back. I moved the mug. The rogue shadow snapped back instantly, becoming the obedient shadow of a mug again. I began to dread sunset, the moment when direct light faded and gloom took over the apartment. The hour of long shadows. My sanctuary of light had become a perceptual minefield. I no longer trusted what I saw. I walked through the loft feeling watched, not by a person but by the geometry of the space itself. Corners seemed deeper, the spaces under furniture darker, and then the shadows started moving on their own. I was reading on the couch. The only light was a floor lamp beside me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. On the floor, a few yards away, the shadow of an empty chair slid slowly, like a stealthy animal, detaching from the chair, casting it. It crept a couple of yards across the floor and stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare move. I turned my head slowly. The chair was still. Its shadow was where it belonged, tethered to its legs. But I'd seen it. I knew I'd seen it. Fear drove me to do what I did best, fight with light. I decided to eradicate the gloom entirely. The next night I installed more spotlights, aiming at every corner, every dead space. I crisscrossed the beams, creating a safety net of light. Not a single square inch of my loft would be left without at least 1,000 lumens. When I finished, the room was blinding. The air hummed with the heat of dozens of bulbs. There wasn't a single shadow. I felt victorious. I'd won. I'd banished the intruders with raw photonic force. I sat at my desk, exhausted but triumphant. Silence returned to the apartment, now bright as an operating room. And then I heard a click. The desk lamp flickered and died. I frowned. I checked the switch. It was on. The bulb was new. I glanced at the ceiling track. One of the spotlights aimed at my desk sputtered and went out. Then another, and another. Like an infection, one by one, my lights began to fail. A cold panic gripped me. This wasn't an electrical failure, it was deliberate. The darkness was fighting back. And it wasn't just extinguishing the lights, it was consuming them. In the cursed corner, the darkness began to spread. It was no longer just a corner. It was a growing stain swallowing the light from nearby spotlights, a solid blackness creeping along the wall like spilled ink. I stood from my chair. The chair's shadow, cast by the remaining lights, twisted on the floor. It rose, detaching from its object, morphing into a tall, thin silhouette, a human figure made of pure absence. It stood still, watching me from across the room. I grabbed the most powerful flashlight I had and aimed its beam directly at the figure. The light hit it but didn't pierce it. The shadow simply absorbed it, the beam ending at its surface like I was shining it at a wall of black velvet. The figure raised an arm, and the last ceiling light above my head exploded, plunging us into near-total darkness. Now, the only light was my trembling flashlight, and the only shadow was the one hunting me. I didn't think. I just reacted. Panic is a primal instinct. I stumbled back, away from the solid black figure, my flashlight shaking and casting wild shadows on the opposite walls. The figure stayed where it was, a human-shaped void, watching me. Its silence was worse than a scream. It was the calm of a predator that knows its prey has no escape. I ran toward the hallway leading to the bedroom, my only thought to put a door, a physical barrier between that thing and me. I reached the threshold, but the hallway wasn't clear. My flashlight's beam lit the floor. The shadow cast by the doorframe itself had widened. It was no longer a thin line on the floor. It had become a solid bar of darkness, a trench of blackness stretching wall to wall. It wasn't flat. It had depth, like a step into an abyss. I skidded to a stop on the wood floor. I aimed the light directly at it. The beam cut off abruptly like it had hit a velvet wall. The light couldn't cross it. It was a physical barrier made of pure absence. I heard a sound behind me, a sliding whisper like heavy fabric dragging across the floor. I turned. The figure had started to move. It didn't walk. It flowed across the loft's floor, a patch of darkness gliding toward me with unnatural speed. I changed direction, running toward the kitchen on the opposite side of the loft. My own shadow, cast by the flashlight in my hand, ran ahead of me, a ghostly guide. And then, my shadow stopped obeying me. I paused for a moment to change course, but my shadow kept moving, sliding a yard farther before stopping to wait for me. When I started running again, my shadow stayed still, anchored to the floor, then lunged forward to catch up with a grotesque, elastic motion. My own dark reflection had rebelled. It was no longer my echo. It was the entity's puppet. It was mocking me, showing me that even the light I controlled now played by its rules. I reached the kitchen. It was my last hope for an improvised weapon. The shadows under the cabinets were no longer passive recesses. They were active pools of darkness, reaching out to snare my feet. I leapt over them, feeling an unnatural cold graze my ankles. The main figure was now in the center of the loft. It stopped. It didn't need to chase me. It simply raised an arm, a limb of pure darkness. The arm stretched, crossing the room in a fraction of a second, a black ribbon slicing through the air. The shadow arm struck the wall by the main door, right where the electrical panel was. I heard metal twist and a dull spark. The entity had destroyed the electrical panel, my last hope of flooding the place with light. It was systematically dismantling my defenses, tearing down my obsession piece by piece. My only option was the bedroom. I ran toward the hallway, leaping over the shadow barrier still blocking the entrance, feeling a cold that burned my feet through my shoes. I dove into the room, slamming the heavy wooden door shut and turning the lock. I leaned against the wood, panting, my body trembling from effort and terror. For a moment there was silence. I was safe, at least temporarily. All I had left was the flashlight. I swept its shaky beam around the room. My bed, a wardrobe, a desk, a wooden chair sat in the corner by the window, the one I used to toss clothes on. Everything seemed normal. The shadows cast by my flashlight seemed calm, obedient, tied to the objects creating them. The air in here felt cleaner, less charged. Then I heard a sound at the door. Not a knock. Not a scratch. A wet, sliding sound, like thick oil slowly seeping over the wood. I aimed the flashlight at the door, and I saw the darkness begin to leak underneath. It wasn't a normal shadow. It was the entity itself, flattening to an impossible thinness, slipping into my sanctuary like viscous black liquid. I stumbled back, tripping over the rug until my back hit the far wall. I watched the patch of darkness on the floor grow, spreading from the door. The main figure didn't need to break the door. It could seep through its cracks. I aimed the flashlight directly at the growing stain. The light hit it but didn't stop it. The darkness flowed around it, indifferent. The pool of blackness covered half the room's floor. It stopped, and then it began to rise. Like a cobra lifting its head, the shadow reared up in the center of the room, taking its tall humanoid form again. We were in the same room. It 3 yards from me frozen against the wall. My only weapon was light, and it didn't work. I raised the flashlight, aiming directly at what should have been its face. The bright white beam was absorbed completely. No reflection, no gleam. And then, the flashlight flickered. Terror seized me. I smacked it, a futile gesture. It flickered again. The white light turned a sickly yellow, weak. The entity was draining the energy, feeding on the very light I used to fight it. The beam faded to an orange glow, barely enough to light my own feet. The shadow figure took a step toward me, and in the near total darkness I saw something I hadn't before. Within its blackness, Two pale points of light ignited, like cold embers. They were its eyes, and they were watching me. The flashlight flickered one last time and died. I was in absolute darkness. The world vanished. My eyes, desperate for something, saw nothing. I was blind. Silence filled the room, so deep I could hear my own heartbeat, a frantic drum in my chest. But I wasn't alone. I heard a sound that couldn't come from the darkness, the sound of something heavy like a wet coat dragging across the wooden floor, a slow, deliberate sound, the sound of the entity. It no longer needed to glide. It was walking, and it was coming for me. My world shrank to sound. I could hear the rustle of its form against the air, a static whisper. I could hear its heavy steps, one after another, each closer than the last. The smell of dust and ozone, like an overheated old TV, filled the room. I took a step back, but my back was already against the wall. There was no escape. I raised my hands, a useless defense against something I couldn't see. The sound stopped. It was right in front of me. I could feel it. The cold radiating from its form was tangible, an absence of warmth that burned my skin. I held my breath, waiting for the end, waiting for its touch, the pain. But it didn't touch me. Instead, I heard a new sound. A creak. The sound of a wooden chair being dragged across the floor. I heard it being placed in front of me. And then, the sound of a heavy body sitting. The entity, the shadow monster, was sitting a yard from me in total darkness. It wasn't attacking, it wasn't touching me. It was just sitting. And it was watching me. The night became an eternity of passive torture. I don't know how many hours I spent like that. My back pressed against the wall, muscles locked, not daring to breathe. Every second was an agony of anticipation. I waited for the touch, the strike, the end. But it never came. The entity was patient. Its torment wasn't physical pain. It was the waiting. The certainty of its presence in darkness so absolute that my mind began conjuring its own hallucinations, sparks of light, shapes that weren't there. Once, I heard a faint sound, like a finger tapping on the chair's wood. It was waiting. Finally, a change. A faint gray began to seep through the bedroom's blinds. The first hint of dawn. The darkness was no longer total, and as the light grew, turning the blackness into a thick gloom, the sound changed. I heard the chair creak again. The entity was standing. I saw its silhouette, a patch of deeper darkness against the room, flow toward the corner farthest from the window. It didn't run. It dissolved, retreating into the building's structural shadows like dirty water vanishing down a drain. When the sun fully lit the room, I was alone. The chair was in the center of the room, out of place. I stumbled out, trembling. The loft was silent. The electrical panel was wrecked. My home, my sanctuary of light, had become its territory. I couldn't live like this. Night would come again, and it would return. Running wasn't an option. I felt it. It was tied to this place, to me. It had destroyed my electric lights, drained my flashlight. My obsession with artificial light had been my downfall. Light wasn't the weapon. It was its food. Or maybe it was the wrong kind of light. But it wasn't all light. It fed on focused electric light, bulbs, LEDs, batteries, drinking it dry. Natural light behaved differently. Moonlight made it recoil, sunlight might burn it. If I was going to fight, I had to use the right kind of light. I sat on the loft's floor, surrounded by my useless tools. I thought about its movements. It flowed, glided, flattened, but it also became solid. It manipulated geometry, created barriers. It was a creature of angles, of negative spaces. It hated light but fed on it. Electric light, focused light, was a challenge to it, a game. But what about pure light, sunlight? I spent the rest of the day working with frantic energy. I lowered the blinds on every window except one, the massive east-facing window. I cleaned every inch of the glass until it was pristine. Then I went to my storage room. I had mirrors. Large, full-length mirrors I'd planned to use for a decor project. I brought them out. My obsession with light transformed. I wasn't trying to eliminate shadows anymore. I was trying to destroy them. This wasn't design. It was war. I began placing the mirrors. I mounted a huge one on the wall opposite the window, creating an infinite bounce. Then I added more, angled, all aimed at the center of the loft and above all, at the cursed corner where the darkness seemed to originate. My goal was simple. If the darkness fed on electric light, I'd drown it in the purest, most chaotic light there was. I'd turn my loft into a photon trap, a maze of mirrors where sunlight would bounce 1,000,000 times, leaving no corner, no crack, for the gloom to spawn. I worked for hours. The loft transformed. It was no longer a home, it was a machine, a light box. I waited for the afternoon. As the afternoon sun dipped, the light pouring through the window was caught and multiplied by the mirrors, creating a blinding, almost painful glow. It was perfect. But night fell, and with it, my fear returned. The moonlight and the city's light pollution were caught by the mirrors, creating a strange, silvery gloom. It wasn't the darkness the creature loved, but it wasn't daylight either. I waited. The silence was total. Midnight passed. Nothing. I started to think it had worked, that I'd scared it off. And then the cursed corner, the one always darker, began to pulse. The blackness started to seep from the wall's seam. The entity was trying to enter. The shadow flowed onto the floor, but the moment it touched the reflected moonlight, it recoiled with a silent hiss, like water on a hot griddle. It was trapped. The mirror light created a barrier it couldn't cross. I saw it move along the room's edges, searching for a gap in my defense, a blind spot. But I'd planned well. There wasn't one. The figure rose in its corner, becoming solid again. The two pale embers ignited. It was watching me, and I felt its rage. The room began to tremble. The mirrors rattled on the walls. I heard the crack of glass. It was using its power to break my trap. The largest mirror, the one creating the main bounce, developed a fine crack. The entity focused its power on it. The crack spread like a spider web. The reflected light began to fracture, losing its intensity. The shadow tested the weakness, extending a tendril of darkness toward the now dimmer floor. I saw the mirror start to warp, about to shatter. I knew I didn't have much time. The trap was breaking. I ran to my bag. I had one last weapon, magnesium flares, the ones I used for long exposure photography. I grabbed a flare, pulled off the cap, and struck it. The flare ignited with a blinding white flash. It was like holding a sun. The light was so intense it burned my eyes. The loft blazed with violent white light, shadowless. The shadow figure screamed. It was a real sound, a tear in the air, a shriek of pure agony. The flare's light, multiplied by the cracked mirrors, hit it from all directions. It had nowhere to hide. Its black form began to boil, to dissolve. It writhed, its shadow arms flailing, trying to create its own shadows for protection, but the light was too intense, too pure. I lit another flare and threw it into the room's center. The light was absolute. The entity shrank, collapsing in on itself, and with a final silent implosion, it vanished. The flares burned out, leaving the room in the silvery gloom of moonlight. The smell of sulfur and ozone was unbearable. But I was alone. The silence had returned. And this time, it was clean. I sold the loft the next day. I moved to a small, low apartment with windows facing an inner courtyard, a place full of normal corners and shadows. I've returned to my work, but my obsession has changed. I no longer seek the perfect light. I've learned that beauty isn't in absolute light or total darkness. It's in the in-between, the gloom where they meet. My battle with the shadows taught me that the only way to appreciate light is to understand the darkness that defines it. And now, for the first time in my life, I'm no longer afraid of dark corners. My world had shrunk to the rhythm of my own breathing, a constant, labored reminder of my fragility. After the factory accident, my lungs were destroyed. Months of hospitalization saved my life, but left me weak, fighting for every breath. My doctor, with a mix of optimism and last resort, recommended the Eternitas Clinic. It was an elite respiratory rehabilitation center, isolated high on a mountain plateau, famous for its pure air and a policy of total quiet, designed for recovery. The cost was astronomical, but my insurance, pressured by the accident settlement, agreed to cover it. Arriving at the clinic was surreal. A sterilized vehicle picked me up in the city and climbed a private road for over an hour, leaving the noisy world behind. The clinic appeared suddenly, a modern building of glass and white stone that contrasted sharply with the wild landscape. It was a work of minimalist architecture, a place that looked more like a laboratory than a hospital. The air was incredibly pure, cold, and so thin that I initially struggled to breathe. There were no gardens, just clean rock and glass. On the glass door I read a technical sign, Eternitas Protocol, air deionization and vital entropy control. The feeling of sterility was total, as if organic life itself were an impurity they were trying to keep at bay. Nurse Sanchez greeted me. She was a tall, middle-aged woman in an impeccable white uniform and an expression of professional calm that bordered on indifference. There was no warmth in her gaze, only cold efficiency. She explained the rules in a soft but firm voice. Total quiet. Communication with staff would be minimal, only what was essential for treatment. There was no television, no radios, no internet connection. Cell phones were forbidden. Everything was designed to eliminate stress and focus solely on breathing. My room was my world. My room was as minimalist as the rest of the building. White walls, a high-tech bed, a single designer chair, and a huge sealed picture window overlooking a landscape of rocks and empty sky. No pictures, no decorations, no distractions. The only visible technology was an advanced medical monitor that silently tracked my oxygen saturation and heart rate. The room was airtight. Filtered air entered with an almost imperceptible hiss. It was the quietest place I had ever been. The first few days were a balm. The silence, broken only by my own difficult breathing, helped me concentrate. I practiced the lung exercises I'd been assigned, watched the clouds move slowly across the window, and slept. Slept deeply without the beeps and murmurs of the city hospital. The pure air seemed to be working. I felt stronger. The first anomaly occurred on the fourth night. I woke up suddenly for no apparent reason. The room was dim, lit only by the faint moonlight. I felt a weight on my chest. It wasn't the usual pain from my injured lungs. It was an external physical compression, as if someone were sitting on my torso. I tried to sit up, but I couldn't move. Panic flooded me. I tried to scream, but no sound came from my throat. And then I felt an icy cold spreading from my chest to my limbs. It wasn't a normal cold. It was a cold that seemed to absorb my own vital heat. I fought against the paralysis, my heart hammering against my ribs, and as quickly as it had come, the weight disappeared. I could breathe again, a shaky gasp of air. I sat up in bed, soaked in cold sweat. I looked around. The room was empty. No one was there. The medical monitor beside my bed blinked with a steady green light. The next morning I told Nurse Sanchez about it. She didn't even look up from her tablet as she took my vitals. Sleep paralysis, she said, her voice monotone. It's a common side effect of the medication and post-traumatic stress. Your brain is adapting to the new environment and the silence. It's normal. I insisted on the compression, the cold. She looked at me for the first time and her eyes were like the window glass, cold and empty. Fear is counterproductive to your recovery, Gabriel. Focus on your breathing. Her explanation was logical, reassuring, but her indifference unsettled me. She didn't ask how I felt, didn't offer comfort. She just noted something down and left. I tried to convince myself she was right. It was a hallucination, a bad dream brought on by the altitude and the drugs. But the next night, it happened again. The same crushing pressure, the same consuming cold. But this time, I heard something. Just before the paralysis took hold, I heard a sound in the silent room. A faint whisper and exhale right next to my ear. Fear began to seep into my recovery. The clinic's quiet was no longer healing, it was expectant. I started noticing other things, sudden shifts in air pressure. Sometimes, while sitting and reading, I'd feel the atmospheric pressure in the room drop sharply, making me cover my ears. It would last a few seconds and then return to normal. Nurse Sanchez attributed it to the high-tech air filtration system, but the phenomena became more deliberate. One afternoon, I was doing my breathing exercises in front of the large picture window. I was focused on my breath, on the rhythm, and then I saw movement on the glass. Not outside, inside. My own breath condensing on the cold glass formed a cloud of fog, but next to my breath another appeared. A perfect circle of condensation, a few inches from mine, and it was at my height. As if someone invisible were standing beside me, breathing slowly against the glass. I jumped back. The second cloud of fog remained there for an impossible second and then vanished. I could no longer deny it, I wasn't alone. There was a presence in my room, an invisible entity that breathed. My scientific obsession gave way to a terrifying investigation. Who had been in this room before me? In the clinic's small library, which contained only books on philosophy and nature, I found a guest book, an elegant volume where patients left their thanks. I looked for my room number. 303. The notes were all positive, praising the pure air and the peace, until I reached the last one. The entry was from 8 months ago. It belonged to a woman named Marta. Her handwriting was shaky, erratic, very different from the others. "I can't breathe," she had written. "The air is full. It's crushing me. I'm not alone. He won't let me sleep. Don't leave me here." The next page was torn out. My heart racing, I looked for her name in the clinic records I could find in the administration office, seizing a moment when it was empty. I found her. Marta Reyes, patient in room 303. Cause of death, spontaneous pulmonary collapse. Her death had occurred just one day after she wrote that note in the guest book. I ran back to my room and locked the door. I sat in the chair, trembling. The same room, the same feeling of being crushed, the same invisible entity. The medical monitor beside my bed flickered. I looked at the screen. My heart rate was elevated, but my oxygen saturation was dropping slowly, even though I didn't feel short of breath. And then I felt it. A sudden cold in the corner of the room. Not a draft. It was a moving point of cold. I saw the thin window curtain stir, ripple, as if an invisible person had just walked past it. The entity was no longer just a sensation. It was moving. It was in the room with me right now, and it was getting stronger. I remained frozen, my gaze fixed on the curtain. It settled back into stillness, but the movement had been unmistakable. A slow, deliberate ripple unrelated to the controlled hiss of the filtered air. The medical monitor beside my bed continued its rhythmic green blinking, a metronome of normalcy in a situation that had ceased to be normal. The entity was no longer a feeling. It was a tenant. It moved. That night I didn't try to sleep. I sat in the single designer chair wrapped in a blanket and watched. I turned my fear into vigilance. I observed the room like a hunter watching the undergrowth, looking for the slightest sign of movement. For hours, nothing happened. The room was calm, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the monitor and the effort of my own lungs. I began to doubt myself again, to wonder if the medication, the isolation, and Marta's ghost had pushed me to the brink of paranoia. Then the cold returned. It wasn't a gradual drop in temperature, but a moving spot, an invisible block of ice that drifted from the corner by the window to the center of the room. I watched my heart rate readings spike on the monitor screen, my body reacting to a stimulus my eyes couldn't see. The entity was there, just a few feet away, observing me. And then came the compression. I wasn't in bed this time, but I felt it just the same. It started in my shoulders, an immense weight pushing me down into the chair, then on my chest. It was the same sensation as the sleep paralysis, but I was wide awake. It was a physical, tangible weight. And then I felt the breathing. The fog on the glass hadn't been a coincidence. I felt an icy exhale against my cheek, frigid air with a faint smell of ozone and dust. And immediately after, I felt the inhale. It was the most terrifying moment of my life. It didn't inhale the air in the room. It inhaled the air from my own lungs. I felt the oxygen being vacuumed out of my body, a hollowing emptiness from within. My chest collapsed, struggling for air, but the invisible entity was stealing it. The medical monitor began to emit a sharp, rapid beeping, a hypoxia alarm. The red warning light flashed, bathing the white room in hellish pulses. I was being suffocated by something I couldn't see. I slammed my fists against the chair, fought against the invisible weight, but my movements were weak. My vision began to tunnel. The monitor's beeping grew distant. I understood Marta's note. I can't breathe, the air is full. And then, as quickly as it began, the attack ceased. The weight vanished. Air rushed back into my lungs in a desperate gasp. I fell to the floor, coughing, my body convulsing. The monitor returned to its rhythmic beep. Seconds later, my room door opened. Nurse Sanchez entered, not with the urgency of an emergency, but with her usual calm. She saw the monitor, then me, trembling on the floor. Her face showed no surprise, no concern. Just that cold clinical efficiency. "A panic attack, Gabriel," she said, her voice monotone. "It's normal in your condition. The altitude can cause a sensation of suffocation." She approached and checked the monitor readings. She pressed a button, silencing the alarm. "Your heart rate is elevated, but your oxygen levels are stabilizing. Get back into bed." I tried to explain. The weight, the fog on the glass, the breathing. She cut me off, her voice a little firmer. "Tactile hallucinations are common. You're fixated on the previous patient. That isn't healthy. Your recovery depends on your calm." She noted something on her digital tablet. I saw her eyes flick from the monitor to me, and for an instant, I detected something in her gaze. It wasn't satisfaction. It was assessment, like a farmer checking on livestock. She helped me up, her touch strong and cold. "We'll give you a mild sedative so you can rest." I refused. She didn't insist. She simply nodded as if expecting that response and left the room. I heard the soft click of the magnetic lock engaging. I knew she was lying. The monitor had registered the drop in oxygen. It had been real, and she had seen it but had chosen to ignore it, to cover it up with a false diagnosis of panic. Paranoia became absolute certainty. The clinic wasn't a place of healing. It was a trap. It was some kind of harvesting farm. And Nurse Sanchez wasn't a caregiver. She was the warden of the cage. My next thought was to escape. I waited until the hallway was quiet. I approached the door. It had no physical lock, just a card reader panel. My patient card, which allowed me access to common areas, was on the table. I grabbed it and swiped it through the reader. The red light flashed. Access denied. I tried again. Access denied. I tried the emergency call button next to the door. I pressed it. Waited. No one answered. I pressed it repeatedly. The small speaker remained silent. They had cut off my communication. They had locked me in. I ran to the picture window. It was a thick pane of glass, hermetically sealed against the steel frame. No handles, no locks. It was designed never to open, to keep the pure air in and the world out, or to keep the patients in. I punched the glass. It was thick, soundproof. My blow barely made a dull thud. I was trapped in room 303, just like Marta, and the sun was beginning to set. The cycle was clear. The entity attacked at night. I had to get out of there before darkness fell. I began searching the room with the energy of a caged animal. I had to find something, anything. I searched the minimalist bathroom. Nothing. I opened the only closet, which contained only identical white robes. But behind a stack of towels, I felt something stuck to the back wall. It was a small device, some kind of transmitter, with the clinic's green indicator light. I ripped it from the wall. It didn't look like part of the medical system. I went back to the room and looked at the monitor beside the bed. It was the only link to the staff. It was my enemy. It continued to track my pulse, my oxygen, and then I realized. Nurse Sanchez didn't need a sedative to calm me. She just had to wait. The absolute quiet, the lack of stimuli, the invisible entity. They did the work. Disorientation was part of the treatment. I approached the monitor and examined the back. It was bolted to the wall, but underneath I saw the data cable running out of it and into a conduit. I pulled on the cable. It was thick, well shielded. I couldn't escape. I couldn't fight something invisible, and I couldn't call for help. My only option was to understand the enemy. I went back to the administration office, but this time in my mind. I knew I couldn't get out through the door, but there was something else, the air vent. It was a metal grill in the ceiling. I climbed onto the chair. The screws were specialized, but with the tip of my metal dinner spoon I managed to turn one, and then another. The work was slow, agonizing. My injured lungs protested the effort of keeping my arms raised. Outside, the daylight was fading. I knew the night would bring the compression again, the suffocation. I had to hurry. Finally, the grill gave way. The opening was narrow, dark, but it was an exit. I pulled myself up into the dusty darkness, feeling the cold metal of the duct against my skin. It was a claustrophobic space, barely wide enough for my body. Decades of dust made me cough, a dry, painful sound that echoed through the metal. I froze, waiting to hear footsteps, Nurse Sanchez's voice, but there was nothing. I started crawling, my lungs burning, toward a faint light I saw at the end of the tunnel, probably from the main corridor. I moved blindly, fearing the invisible entity was right behind me. As I moved away, I glanced down one last time through the open hole in the ceiling. I saw room 303, empty, lit only by the green light of the medical monitor. And on the screen, I saw something impossible. The monitor was still registering my vital signs. The image on the monitor froze me. The green light blinked with a calm rhythm. My pulse, stable. My oxygen saturation, perfect. But the bed in room 303 was empty. I was up here, in a dirty, narrow ventilation duct. I understood with absolute horror that the monitor wasn't connected to my physical body, but anchored to my vital presence, which was somehow still tied to that room. The clinic wasn't monitoring me. It was consuming me. I covered my mouth, terrified. The duct was narrow, I could barely crawl. My damaged lungs struggled for air in the claustrophobic space. I had to move. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from room 303. I crawled blindly, following the metal tunnel. The air up here wasn't filtered. It smelled of decades of neglect, of rust and something else. The same faint ozone scent I had smelled in my room. I could hear the hum of fans, a dull, constant sound that seemed to come from the depths of the building. I headed toward it. If this clinic was a machine, I was going to find its engine. As I moved forward, the cold intensified. The metal of the duct became glacial to the touch, and then I felt the air pressure change. The hum of the fans seemed to falter, and I felt a current of icy air coming toward me, flowing against my direction. And with it, the entity. It wasn't a vague sensation. It was in the duct with me. I felt the invisible weight, the mass of cold approaching in the total darkness. I pressed myself against the tunnel wall, trying to become small. There was nowhere to hide. The entity reached me. It didn't touch me. It simply passed by me, a torrent of cold and compression that emptied the breath from my chest. I felt the same sensation of suffocation, the same terror I had felt in bed. The entity was patrolling the ducts. The ventilation system wasn't just for air, it was its highway. It moved away, and I was left trembling, struggling to catch my breath. I knew I couldn't stay there. I kept crawling, descending through a vertical shaft, following the increasingly loud hum of the main machinery. I reached a grill in the floor of the duct. It looked down into a place I hadn't seen, the technical basement. It was an immense, sterile white room. The floor was polished like a mirror. It wasn't a boiler room. It was a laboratory. And in the center was the machine. It was a huge apparatus, a lung of steel and glass. Dozens of thick tubes covered in frost snaked out of it and disappeared into the ceiling, heading to all the rooms, all the ducts. My gaze caught a red emergency lever on its base, labeled Purge. but my attention focused on the wall of monitors. They were identical to the one in my room, dozens of them. Room 301, 302, 304, all showed stable, rhythmic vital readings just like mine. But I knew the clinic had very few patients. Most of those rooms were empty. The clinic wasn't just feeding on me. It was maintaining the echoes of everyone who had been here before. Marta. And the others. Next to the monitors, I saw a desk, and sitting at it was Nurse Sanchez. She wasn't watching the monitors, she was reading a book, calmly, as if she were in the break room. I kicked the grill with all my strength. It fell to the floor with a metallic clang. I dropped down after it, landing awkwardly on the polished floor. Nurse Sanchez looked up from her book. There was no surprise in her eyes, no fear, just a slight irritation like someone who has been interrupted. "You should be in your room, Gabriel," she said, her voice calm. "Your recovery will be affected." "What is this place?" I gasped, pointing at the machine. "What are you doing to us?" She sighed and set the book aside. "It's a sanctuary," she said, "a place of peace. The mountain air is pure, but what we do here perfects it. We cleanse the air of everything, dust, bacteria, and the entropy of life. What you feel is the air itself seeking balance. It takes the vital breath." "Marta Reyes," I said, my voice trembling. "Spontaneous pulmonary collapse." "Marta was a success," she corrected without emotion. "Her transition was complete. She joined the silence. It was her ultimate goal, absolute peace." I understood the clinic's demented logic. They didn't heal people, they emptied them. The peace they offered was the peace of the void. And Nurse Sanchez was the high priestess of this nothingness. She saw the determination on my face. She rose slowly from her chair. On the table next to her book was a hypodermic syringe filled with a clear liquid, a sedative, like the one she had offered me. "I won't let you do the same to me," I said, backing toward the large machine. "Your recovery is no longer our priority," she said, picking up the syringe. "You are now a contaminant. You've seen the machinery. You cannot leave." She advanced toward me. I was weak, my lungs barely functioning. She was strong, calm. I stood no chance in a physical fight. I backed up until my back touched the icy metal of the central machine. The steel lung. I felt its vibrations, and my eyes fixed on the red emergency lever I had seen upon entering, the one labeled Purge. I didn't know what it would do, but it was my only option. As Sanchez lunged at me, the needle glinting, I threw myself sideways and pulled the lever with the full weight of my body. A deafening shriek shook the building. It wasn't an alarm, it was the machine. A violent tremor ran through the floor. The lights in the room flickered and turned red, and the large intake pipe burst open. But air didn't rush in. It rushed out. A blast of glacial, visible air, a thick white fog, erupted from the machine. It was the entity. It was the concentrated air, the collective breath of all the patients released at once. Nurse Sanchez screamed, a very human, very terrified sound. The fog enveloped her. I saw her body freeze instantly, her face contorted in a mask of surprise. She stood motionless, a statue of ice. The wave of cold hit me, knocking me down. I felt the compression in my chest, the suction of my breath. It was unleashed. I crawled toward the basement door, my lungs burning. Behind me, I heard the monitors on the wall explode one by one in a cascade of sparks and glass. I climbed the stairs, emerged into the main hallway. The clinic was chaos. Icy fog poured from every vent. The doors to the rooms were blown open. The staff, the few I had seen, lay frozen in the corridors. I reached the main entrance. The glass doors were covered in frost. I shattered them with a chair and stumbled out into the pure mountain air. I ran, tripped, fell in the snow and kept crawling, away from the silent clinic. Months have passed, my lungs never fully recovered. But I'm alive. The Eternitas clinic was found weeks later. Authorities spoke of a catastrophic failure in the liquid oxygen system, an inexplicable accident. No one asked why all the bodies seemed to have died of suffocation in a place full of air. I live in the city now. The air is dirty, heavy, full of fumes and noise, and I breathe it gratefully every day. I discovered on that mountain that absolute quiet isn't peace. It's a void. And the void always, always looks for something to fill it. Healing isn't found in purity, but in the imperfect chaos of staying alive. The house was always a refuge against the noise of the world. It was set back at the end of a dirt road the forest had almost completely reclaimed. The nearest town was barely a murmur of life several miles away, a place where shops closed before sunset and the streets lay deserted under the pale light of a few street lamps. My existence here was deliberately monotonous, almost hermit-like. I spent my days reading in the dusty living room, tending the small garden that resisted the shade of the old pines, or simply listening to the wind complain through the branches. Solitude was my only companion, a constant presence, but one I had chosen, one that didn't threaten me. The house itself seemed to breathe with me. It was old, with timbers that creaked with temperature changes, and pipes that moaned softly at night. I knew every one of its sounds. They were part of my silence. Everything in my life had an order, a predictable cadence that kept me anchored to reality. The days passed without incident, until time began to break. The first time it folded in on itself, I ignored it, or perhaps my mind chose to ignore it. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, a thick book on my lap. The late afternoon light streamed through the picture window, a dense orange light that tinged the dust motes floating lazily in the air with gold. I distinctly remember turning page 47. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the upstairs hallway. It was dark. The nearly full moon cast a pale square on the wooden floor. The book was closed on the living room end table. I was cold and had a metallic taste in my mouth. My heart beat with a strange calm, but my mind frantically sought an explanation. I considered sleepwalking, though I'd never suffered from it. I dismissed it as simple overtiredness, a mental lapse caused by lack of sleep. But it happened again, and this time it was undeniable. I was making dinner. I put a pot of water on to boil on the old gas stove. I turned for a second, just a second, to grab the salt from the shelf right behind me. When I looked back at the pot, the water had almost completely evaporated. The bottom of the pot was blackened and thick steam filled the kitchen. The wall clock, that old cuckoo clock my grandfather had hung, indicated that 45 minutes had passed. I remembered nothing of that interval. I didn't remember moving, or thinking, or breathing. I checked my hands. They were dry, not red from the steam. It was as if my body had been paused, oblivious to the heat and the passage of time. The stillness of that moment was worse than the shock. It was proof that something was emptying me. I only felt an icy void in my stomach, a terrible feeling of having been disconnected and reconnected. It was then that I started finding the marks. The first time was the day after the kitchen incident. I was cleaning the windowsill overlooking the forest, the one that always seemed to collect more dirt. I saw a small triangle drawn with unsettling precision. It wasn't paint, nor was it scratched into the wood. It was dust. An extremely fine ash, almost silvery gray, that disintegrated at the slightest touch, but left a faint stain on the old wood. I thought it was some strange type of mold or a residue carried by the wind, although the window had been closed. I wiped it away with a damp cloth. The next morning it was there again, identical, perfect, and not just there. I found it on the threshold of the back door. Not one, but 3 small triangles arranged to form a larger one. I stopped feeling alone in the house. The solitude that was once comfortable now felt tense, expectant. The silence was no longer peace. It was the pause before a sound that never quite arrived. I began to notice subtle changes, things my rational mind tried to dismiss. Objects not quite where I had left them. A chair in the dining room, slightly moved. The basement door, which I always kept shut with a heavy bolt because of the damp, I found open one morning. And not only that, the keys I always left in the bowl by the entrance would appear on the kitchen table, Books I was sure I had left in the living room I'd find stacked in the study. At first, I blamed myself. My mind was playing tricks on me due to loneliness, I told myself. I attributed everything to my own distraction, to the mental fatigue caused by those inexplicable time lapses. I was becoming forgetful, I repeated to myself. But the feeling of being watched intensified. I no longer just felt observed from the forest. The trees at night seemed unnatural. Their silhouettes against the cloudy sky leaned toward the house. Sometimes I thought I saw a quick movement in the corner of my eye, just beyond the reach of the porch light, a contracting shadow. But when I looked directly, there was only darkness and the constant whisper of the wind through the pines. I started closing all the curtains as soon as the sun went down. I sealed the windows not because of the cold, but out of an irrational need to create a barrier. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every tap of a branch against the glass brought on a cold sweat. The real horror began 3 nights ago. It was the first time I saw them, or rather unequivocally felt their presence. I woke up suddenly, or perhaps I was never asleep. I was in my bed, lying on my back. The room was plunged into almost absolute darkness, but I could see. I knew with terrifying certainty that my eyes were open. I tried to move, tried to lift an arm to reach for the lamp, tried to turn my head toward the door, tried to close my eyes. I couldn't. I was completely immobilized. A total paralysis, heavy as lead. Panic rose in my throat, a silent scream I couldn't release, vibrating in my chest. My breathing was shallow, barely a thread of air entering and leaving my lungs. Then I saw them. They didn't come through the door or the window. They seemed to seep from the darkest corners of the room where the wall met the ceiling. They were shadows, but they were denser shadows, darker than the darkness that surrounded them. They moved with a deliberate slowness, like thick oil spilling into water. They had no definite shape, formless masses contracting and expanding. There were several of them. I instantly felt the cold emanating from them. It was an unnatural cold, a cold that didn't penetrate the skin but seemed to originate from within my bones, freezing my blood. They slid across the room without making a sound. They stopped around my bed. They didn't touch me. They just stayed there, motionless, surrounding me. They cast no shadows because they were shadow itself. Where they stopped, the darkness became absolute, swallowing the little moonlight that filtered in. I felt their collective attention, an invisible weight on my chest adding to the paralysis. There was no sound. The silence in the room deepened, grew dense as if the air itself had solidified, absorbing all vibration. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my body was a tomb. Only my eyes could move, darting from one shape to another, trying to find a meaning that didn't exist. They were ancient. I knew it in that instant. Older than the house, older than the forest. I couldn't breathe. I could only stare wide-eyed as these masses of pure blackness observed me. They had no eyes, no features, but I felt their attention fixed on me. It was an analytical, cold attention, devoid of any emotion I could recognize except for an overwhelming sense of malevolence. Not hatred, something worse. A clinical indifference like a scientist observing an insect. I don't know how much time passed. It could have been a minute or the whole night. Time had lost all meaning. As suddenly as it had begun, the paralysis released me. I gasped for air so forcefully it tore at my throat. I sat up in bed with a violence that made my neck muscles ache. The room was empty. The darkness was normal again. I was soaked in a cold, sticky sweat. I scrambled to turn on the light, tripping over my own feet. Nothing. The corners were empty. The door, closed. But when my gaze fell to the wooden floor beside the bed, I saw it, drawn with impossible precision on the floor. A perfect triangle made of that fine, silvery ash. They had been in my room. They had been here with me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in the living room armchair with every light in the house on, something I never did. The electricity hummed in the walls, a sound that normally irritated me, but that night was my only ally against the profound silence the shadows had left behind. I stared at my bedroom door, now closed, as if it were the entrance to another world. The ash triangle was still there on the wooden floor. I didn't dare touch it again. At first light, when the grayish sun began to dilute the darkness, I approached cautiously. I knelt. The dust was incredibly fine. When I blew on it gently, it didn't scatter like normal ash. It seemed to cling to the wood as if it had weight before slowly fading, leaving a pale, almost invisible stain. I spent the day in a state of feverish exhaustion. I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination, sleep paralysis, a known, albeit terrifying, phenomenon. But the stain on the floor was real. The time lapses were real. My mind, which had always been my fortress, my safe place, now felt like treacherous territory. I decided it couldn't happen again. If the problem was sleep, I wouldn't sleep. If the problem was darkness, I would live in the light. I reinforced the house, though I knew it was a futile gesture. The entities hadn't used the door. Still, I nailed wooden planks across the back door. I blocked the basement entrance with a heavy cabinet. I checked every window, making sure the latches were firm. Every noise from the forest, the snap of a branch, the hoot of an owl, made me jump. The feeling of being watched hadn't left with the daylight. It had retreated, waiting in the shadows at the edge of the forest, just where the yard ended and the woods began. I felt the latent malevolence like atmospheric pressure just before a thunderstorm. I made pots of coffee one after another. I ate without appetite just to keep my body functioning. My plan was simple. I would stay in the kitchen, the brightest room with the fewest dark corners, and wait out the night. Armed with electric light and caffeine, I would face whatever lurked in my home. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. The cuckoo clock on the wall chimed every hour, a strident sound shattering the tense quiet. 10 more p.m., 11 more p.m., midnight. I was reading a book, though my eyes scanned the same lines over and over without comprehension. My head kept nodding with fatigue. The caffeine only made me jittery. My hands trembled slightly, but exhaustion weighed on my eyelids like lead. I stood up to splash cold water on my face. The cold tile floor under my bare feet helped center me for a second. I looked at myself in the small mirror hanging by the sink. My eyes were sunken, bloodshot. I looked like a stranger. And then it happened. I was standing there, water dripping from my chin onto the floor. I blinked. When I opened my eyes, I was in the attic. The confusion was absolute and chilling. The attic was a place I never went. It was filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, resembling a crowd of motionless ghosts. The air was heavy, thick with dust and the sweet, nauseating smell of rotten wood and stagnant time. It was completely dark, except for a single moonbeam entering through a dirty skylight. I was cold, a cold that pierced much deeper than the previous nights. I looked at my hands. They were covered in that same silvery gray ash. I had been touching something. My feet were bare on the rough, splintered floor. Panic made me move. I ran toward the trapdoor in the floor, the only exit. It was closed. I pulled on the metal ring, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck, or worse, latched from the outside. I shouted, a sound muffled by the claustrophobic space. I pounded on the wood. No one could hear me. I was trapped. I turned, frantic, looking for another way out, another explanation. My gaze swept over the sheet-covered shapes. They weren't moving, but they weren't still in the same way as before. I felt their presence before I saw them. They weren't shadows. This time they had form, or they were borrowing it. The sheets covering the furniture began to move. Not from the wind, there was no draft. They rippled, swelled, and contracted slowly, as if something underneath them was breathing. I scrambled backward, bumping into a stack of old trunks. One of the sheets slid slowly to the floor, revealing not an armchair, but a compact darkness that seemed to absorb the moonbeam. It was condensing. Then the paralysis returned. This time was different. I wasn't in bed. I was standing, or rather, cowering against the attic wall. My body froze, but my mind was still screaming. The dark shapes, now freed from their sheets, glided across the floor. There were more than I remembered. They moved effortlessly, without friction. They surrounded me. This time they didn't stop to observe. One of them approached. It rose up in front of me, a featureless column of night. I felt the intense cold, but also something else. A low vibration, a hum I felt more in my teeth than in my ears. It was a sound that didn't travel through the air, but through my bones. I felt a pressure, not a physical touch. It was a mental invasion, cold, analytical, and painful. I felt as if something were rummaging inside my head, flipping through my thoughts. I saw images of my own life flash before my eyes, but distorted, seen from an alien perspective. I saw my childhood, the garden of this house when I was a boy. I saw my mother's face, but her features were blurry, as if the entity couldn't comprehend it. The pain was sharp, an instant, blinding migraine. They weren't observing. They were extracting. They were feeding. They were looking for something specific. I felt them probing my fears, my deepest memories, cataloging them with terrifying efficiency. I don't know how much time passed. The sensation stopped as abruptly as it had begun. I fell to the wooden floor, shaking violently. The shapes had retreated. The attic was silent again, just dusty furniture. The trapdoor was still closed. I crawled toward it and pounded with my last strength. Suddenly, the trapdoor opened from below. I fell through the opening, landing hard in the second-floor hallway. The light was on. I looked up. No one was there. The trapdoor was open, as if I had opened it myself, but I knew I hadn't. The kitchen downstairs was exactly as I had left it. The coffee in the thermos was still hot. The clock read only 5 minutes past midnight. All that horror, the attic, the paralysis, the mental invasion had happened in less than 5 minutes of my time. Or perhaps time no longer belonged to me. I went downstairs, trembling. My body was sore. I looked at my hands. The silvery ash was gone. They were clean. Maybe it was a hallucination. Maybe exhaustion was driving me mad. I needed to cling to that idea. I went to the bathroom to wash my face again. I turned on the light and looked at my reflection. The man in the mirror looked defeated. It was then that I saw it, on my left forearm. It wasn't dust, it wasn't ash, it was a mark. A perfect triangle, the size of a small coin. It wasn't drawn on the skin. It seemed to be under it. It was a pale mark, like an old scar, but I knew it hadn't been there before. I touched it. The skin was cold at that exact spot. A dead cold that didn't spread to the rest of my arm, but remained isolated in that geometry. The mark on my arm wasn't a drawing. It was part of me. They had branded me like an animal. I understood that they weren't just invading my house anymore. They were invading me. I stood in the bathroom under the humming fluorescent light, staring intently at the mark on my forearm. It was a pale blemish, an impossible geometry beneath my skin. The cold emanating from it didn't lessen. It was a constant, dead chill that seemed anchored to my bones. My first impulse was to try and remove it. I went to the kitchen, grabbed a small knife, the one I used for peeling fruit. I placed the tip over the mark. I wanted to break the skin, to dig out whatever they had implanted, but my hand wouldn't obey. My fingers refused to tighten on the handle. It wasn't paralysis like before. It was a lack of will, as if a part of my brain, a part that no longer belonged to me, considered the action completely unnecessary. I dropped the knife. It clattered against the tile floor with a metallic noise that echoed in the silence. The initial panic, the sharp fear, was being replaced by something much worse. An unnatural calm, an icy apathy. The cold from the mark began to spread. It was no longer just a spot on my arm. I felt it climbing up my shoulder, settling in my chest. It felt like glacier water being injected directly into my veins. My heart rate, which should have been racing, was slow and heavy. My breathing was shallow, barely a murmur. I walked out of the bathroom. The house felt different, or perhaps it was I who had changed. The lit lights that had previously offered security now seemed weak, almost useless. The shadows in the corners of the living room and at the end of the hallway seemed denser, deeper, as if the light could no longer fully penetrate them. And then I saw the triangles. There weren't just a few anymore hidden on windowsills or the floor of my room. They were everywhere. Drawn in that silvery ash, they covered the hallway walls. Perfect little glyphs aligned in patterns my mind couldn't decipher. They were on the window panes, but drawn from the inside. They were on the living room ceiling, forming a spiral that converged above my empty armchair. The house was no longer my refuge. It was being prepared. It was being claimed, turned into a temple or a nest. My presence was no longer that of an owner, but just another component in the decor. The hum I had felt in the attic returned, or perhaps it had never left. It was a constant background noise in my head, a low vibration that made the world seem unstable. I tried to flee. It was the last survival instinct I had left. I grabbed the car keys from the bowl where I always left them. I ran to the front door. The heavy brass doorknob was covered in that same silvery ash. When my hand touched it, I didn't feel cold metal. I felt a jolt of that paralyzing energy, an intense cold shooting up my arm. My hand stuck for an instant, not from any sticky substance, but by an alien will. I jumped back. The door was sealed. Not physically, not with nails or planks. It was sealed by that presence. I went back to the living room. The exhaustion was absolute. My 2-day fight against sleep was over. It didn't matter anymore. I collapsed into the armchair. The cold in my chest had settled permanently. I looked at the cuckoo clock on the wall. It was 3:15 a.m. I blinked, a slow, heavy blink. I looked at the clock again. Still 3:15 a.m. The clock had stopped, but the second hand wasn't still. It vibrated erratically in place, unable to advance. Time hadn't been lost in lapses. Time inside the house had simply stopped. I was trapped. Trapped in my house, trapped in my body, trapped in an instant, and then they returned. They didn't seep from the corners. They didn't glide from the darkness. This time they materialized from the marks. The triangles on the walls seemed to liquefy, spilling darkness onto the floor. The room filled with them in seconds. They were more solid than before, almost physical. The room's temperature plummeted. I could see my own breath, a white mist dissolving into the blackness. They surrounded me. There was no paralysis. They didn't need it. I no longer wanted to move. The cold inside me vibrated in sync with their presence. The hum in my head intensified into a silent chorus. One of the shapes, larger than the others, slid in front of me. A column of pure night. It stopped inches from my face. I could feel its absolute attention, a cold, ancient curiosity. I felt no malevolence this time. I felt satisfaction. Like a craftsman admiring his finished work. It extended a shadow appendage. It didn't reach for my face or my chest. It moved slowly toward the mark on my forearm. When it touched it, there was no pain. There was a connection. It felt like closing an electrical circuit. I felt their thoughts, or rather the vast, incomprehensible consciousness they represented. They were cold, geometric, ancient. They weren't extracting my memories this time. They were downloading something into me. They were using me as a vessel, as an anchor to fix themselves to this world. The download was instantaneous, not images or words, but pure concepts. Dark, sacred geometry, the physics of twilight, the architecture of the void between worlds. I felt their purpose. They weren't evil in the human sense. They were simply expansive. They were the natural order of darkness, reclaiming spaces that light had held for too long. And I was their first doorway, their first foothold in this reality. The abduction wasn't to take me away. It was so they could stay. My vision changed. I stopped seeing the room with my eyes. I began to perceive it as they did. Not colors, but patterns of heat, fear, and energy. I saw the house's structure, not as wood and brick, but as lines of force. The droning in my head cleared, becoming a kind of language, a communication of pure intention. I looked at my own hand, the one with the mark. It glowed faintly in the dark, but it was a cold light, a light only I could see. It no longer felt like my hand, but a tool. My entire body was a conduit. The hum in my head was no longer noise. It harmonized. It became a silent song, the mathematics of their existence, and I understood it. I could feel the earth beneath the house, the roots of the forest trees, and I could feel the cold, empty space they came from. They were weaving their reality over mine, using the triangles like stitches. The cuckoo clock on the wall suddenly chimed, a single, strident stroke that broke the frozen moment. Time was moving again, but it was no longer my time. It was theirs. I heard the sound of the front door, the one I hadn't been able to open. It opened with a slow creak of old wood. The cold night air from outside rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. But it carried something else. I felt, through my new perception, more presences approaching from the forest. Not shadows this time, but more complex forms ready to join the occupation. The door hadn't opened to let me out. It had opened to welcome the true owners. It was no longer my house, it was no longer my body. The shadows moved around me with familiarity, ignoring me, busy with their tasks. My apathy wasn't defeat, it was integration. I was just another piece of furniture, a node in the network they were building. The first light of dawn, which I had always waited for as a salvation, began to filter through the window. But it no longer brought me comfort. The light seemed weak, a temporary intruder in a world that now belonged to the gloom. I understood that the solitude I had valued so much, my life set apart from the world, hadn't been a fortress. It had only served to empty the vessel. I had made the work easy for them, preparing a silent, empty space ready to be filled by these new guests. My isolated existence hadn't protected me. It had simply made me the perfect host, the first stone in their silent invasion.